Being a country boy, I'd never even heard of geology or geophysics. I got my first degree in chemistry and then spent 2 years in the Army in Korea. And I had lived there under fairly primitive conditions for 2 years. So when I came back from Korea as a disabled veteran, I went to school and found that at university I had a hard time adjusting to being in a chemistry laboratory in the summertime in Nebraska. I felt closed in. And I had a girlfriend, one always has a girlfriend at key points of one's life, who worked for the geology department manager. And she said that she thought that I could join the geology department. And when I visited with this gentleman, to my astonishment, he let me transfer from the Graduate School of Chemistry to the Graduate School of Geology with deficiencies. The major deficiency being that I had never taken a course in geology. So I took all my courses in parallel, Geology 1 and the graduate courses. Nothing but geology and I think 2 physics classes for the next 4 years. And I found I really liked that blend of the hard sciences with the more imaginative part of it. And I've never regretted it.
When was your first field trip, and how did that influence your thinking?
Well, it was nice, but you must remember that I was kind of pretty hardened to being out of doors, both as a country boy and 2 years in Korea and the Philippines, living in a jungle hammock. So out of doors and walking around was not a big deal for me. But so I would not say that the field trip per se was an awakening. It was more the immensity of geology. Mathematics has finite parts to it. Whoever gets to the end of geology, in fact, as you caught us when you came in today, who gets to the end of a geologic discussion except breaks for dinner time?
So after you moved into the geology department, how did you proceed to wind up at Shell and to get into your early career?
Well, totally accidentally, I would say. My actual background in geology was I was on my way to a PhD in theoretical igneous petrology. I had a universal stage. For my chemistry background, I was much more into igneous, and I had only a part of one course in anything to do with petroleum geology. But I was married, we had a child coming along, and I realized that I was going to have to get a job, and very few people are interested in a theoretical igneous petrologist, and Shell, to my astonishment, didn't care. They just hired me. I like to say then that I started at the top in Shell and then gradually worked my way down, because unusually I started at the senior level at the area office, assigned to the area exploration manager as a gopher, and then gradually moved my way down.
Well, what were some of your early experiences in oil and gas exploration? Do you have some stories? Early experiences?
Well, learning really. Shell, as you know, in those days didn't care what degree you had, didn't care what school you went to. To be brutal about it, they just hired for brains, and they figured they would teach you all you needed to know, and they'd do it the Shell way. So I was fortunate to come into that setting, as I knew so little. I found myself very attracted to the geophysicists because that was yet another area that I knew nothing about. But I had a much better background in optics than anyone else did, and so my entry into geophysics and geology came through my knowledge of optics. And I found that, in fact, one of the early experiences I had was we had one of the very first lasers, commercial lasers, and an older geophysicist had the idea that we might be able to do data processing with lasers, with coherent light. And though I only had 6 months or so with the company, he knew that I had a physics and optics background. So for about 6 months, I got to work with a geophysicist in doing optical data processing to try to do things like filter out 60 cycle data out of analog data. Very easy to do with optical filtering. And just about the time that I thought I was going to be a young genius in the geophysical department, why, we smartly moved to digital data processing instead of analog, so I moved away from that. You know, I like that. I really feel that one needs to reinvent oneself about every 5 years, or you just stagnate. And so I've always kind of welcomed that challenge of doing something new or different. I don't want to be an expert who just stays in a field. And I would say that I would probably been considered within Shell and within ARCO or the world, an expert on a number of different things, all different over my life, but I like that change.
But that also mean that you couldn't go so much in depth as you would have liked, so you have to be superficial, or isn't that true?
Well, I like to think that damn few people know as much as I do about some of these fields, but that's arrogance on my part. I've always felt that the only thing that I had going for me was I could learn faster than anyone else. I've been a speed reader all my life, so I devour books. I've never had anyone who reads as fast as I do, and that's a minor talent, but when you use it to learn, then it's a powerful thing.
Yeah, so it seems also that your career was like horizontal in the geology. So you saw so many different branches of the geology. Instead, nowadays, students are like very focused on one topic and they're like hyper specialized.
Well, in fact, don't you think that's the problem with academics? That's why though Shell hired PhDs without prejudice. Think of that phrase, without prejudice. Most companies in the past would not hire a PhD because they felt they were already so proud of their narrow focus of knowledge. Get them to branch out and be broad, to look at what problems the company thought was important. Shell figured that they'd hire PhDs, but they'd treat them just like anyone else. You didn't use your title, it didn't show up in your business card, and you were paid just like anyone else.
An amazing culture. Shell really had. Can you tell us a little bit about the Shell culture and what it meant to you?
Well, I'll put it this way. Because Shell just hired for brains, you had all of these marvelous people who came out of astrophysics, who, like me, theoretical igneous petrology, finding oil. And what they wanted to do was to try to get those very bright people interested in shell problems. And then they wanted to assemble you into teams to solve difficult problems. And rank had very little role in it. In contrast, I remember many years later when I spent time teaching in China, my main difficulty in teaching in China was to get people, when you would ask them questions, not to defer to the oldest person there to answer. They were so respectful of age that they were waiting to see what Mr. Wang would say first. In Shell, we were pretty free to pop off to give our own opinions, whether we had 2 years or 20 years, and that was a great advantage. I actually had no idea how good the Shell technocracy was until I left it. When I left it, after 30 years, I went to another company almost exactly the same size, Arco. Arco at that time was the largest producer of oil in North America. Yet the Arco staff, though they might have started off with technical degrees, were in every case were MBAs. They looked at the world as financiers. Shell had the reverse. I never met an MBA in Shell. All the senior vice presidents were noted scientists. Don Russell, National Academy of Engineering, president of the Society of Mechanical Engineers, Society of Petroleum Engineers, and he wasn't unusual. Most of the people were like that. So in Shell, you felt like you had to run hard just to be as good as the person next to you. And you had no idea of relativeness, how good those people really were. But I noticed when I got that Sidney Powers Medal, I ended up counting up how many of those people who've gotten the Sidney Powers Medal in the last 30 years, 7 others were friends of mine, and the 8th I knew, and we sponsored his thesis when he was going to school in Holland. And he was part of the sedimentary group there. So think of that, in 30 years to have, however you count it, say 9 people to come out of one small group, that's extraordinary.
So at the core is good science and good scientists, would you say?
Yes, yes. You had so many levels of review, not with nitpicking things of you looked at this or that, but by people who generally knew more than you did, at least about some part of the problem. So even when I was a vice president, when I would go to John Bookout and the board, they would query me about the details of, how did you determine that that Cretaceous sand in Brazil actually has 70 feet of pay and it'll flow at these kind of rates? You know, they knew what kind of questions to ask, and they weren't bashful about doing it. So I was pretty much shaped by that Shell experience and those people that I grew up with there.
Any special mentors or people that had
A lot of people, But, you know, you hear stories sometimes about cutthroat business, about people pushing and shoving and hurting other people in their push for power. My own story is that on the second time I was assigned to the research lab in geochemistry, Fred Meissner and I, who you remember, were brought in to mix with a group of chemists to try to find useful ideas from the geochemistry that was being done. After I'd been there a year, my boss, a wonderful gentleman named Archie Hood, called me into his office Friday afternoon, shut the door behind me, asked me to sit down. Well, times were tough in the oil business then. And Archie said, "Marlan, I've decided that you can run the research group better than I can. Monday, you will be in charge of organic geochemical research, and I will be working for you. Have a nice weekend." Now that's what I'd found in Shell. So I had a lot of mentors.
But it is also true that Shell kept pushing you towards the management once you were a chief geologist, right?
Yes, I really thought that the best job I ever had was being chief geologist.
Yeah, so how did you behave when you were pushing toward the management?
Well, I didn't want to be a manager, but I don't recall that they ever said, "Marlan, would you?" I just showed up and was told, "Marlan, tomorrow we formed a new division. It's going to be called the Alaska Division. You'll be in this building, and you'll have about 60 or 80 people working for you. You're the new division manager." So it wasn't anything that I asked for or particularly wanted, but they kept doing that. And always before I was quite done, before I quite had it the way I wanted, I was always pushed off to do something else. And
So how did you feel when you really liked what you were doing in your scientific part, but you were also attracted by the management?
I'll tell you what I did. I actually tried to do both. Only now what I did is I'd publish on work that I did at home myself. So my first paper in the AAPG was a paper on seals for hydrocarbons. I was careful not to make use of any Shell work, and I did it from literature and experience myself. And though I asked Shell for permission to publish, I made it plain that none of it was done on Shell time within Shell. So I would say one unusual thing about me is that, some people know me perhaps more as former president of Pectin or former president of ARCO International, but I'm probably better known just for pure science contributions. I've always tried to stay on top of that, and as part of it, I've organized and participated in 5 of the Hedberg research conferences myself. Those were a method for me to stay in a participatory part of the technology.
So since you dedicate a lot of your spare time to the pure geology, how did your family react?
Now there's a problem. My family has told me that unfortunately they rarely saw me. And it was only when my wonderful daughter was full grown and working for an oil company, and she herself was responsible for a lease sale, did she have any idea of the kind of responsibility that I felt being in charge of lease sales, as an example, when I would typically work 7 days a week for many months. I have not been as good to my family as I would have liked. but it was one of those things, I was so entranced with the technology that I'm afraid I did that part too much. I normally would work, when I was at the research lab, there was a regular group that would show up every Saturday and Sunday. We wouldn't work all day, but we'd be there for Saturday and Sunday every week. I can remember once, many years later, when I had remarried, after a year or two, my wife Maria asked me, Marlan, in Shell, don't they give you vacations? I said, of course, I get 6 weeks vacation, but I'm always so busy that I've never had time to, take one. She said, let me handle this. So she went down to see my secretary and put big red lines through 6 weeks, and I took a vacation.
You mentioned the research lab, and I know that research labs are extremely important to you. What are your thoughts today, and where is the research coming from that is part of our industry?
Just terrible. Industry has really shot itself in the foot starting about 20 years ago. All sorts of short-sighted people that have no idea of the incredible competitive advantage that good research gives to an oil and gas company. Not knowing what kind of advantages it gives the company, they have no idea how to value it. Instead of crediting it as a remarkable asset, they mark it down as a cost. I did a lot for ARCO's research lab too when I went there. At the start coming in, it was being supported totally out of head office and thereby getting little functional support. You can imagine how little support a head office gives to a research lab. By the time I left 7 years later, the operating companies were picking up 90% of the costs of the research lab. We had a pretty vibrant research lab there.
Is there a particular example that you can give as bright spots?
Well,
how
sure.
about one of these technologies?
How about organic geochemistry? We were never able to publish a single paper of all the work we did on organic geochemistry, as it was considered so critical to Shell, and yet a decade before any other company, we were sieving prospective areas to eliminate only gas areas at a time when we only wanted oil. We developed the pyrolysis FID equipment, later called Rocky Val. We developed and created vitrinite reflectants with Mrs. Teichmuller long before anyone else had any of this material. We had data on how oil was generated, expelled, and trapped. I went to a Hedberg conference, a Gordon Research Conference on geochemistry, and it attracted people from all over the world, and they were a decade behind what J.T. Smith and I, who attended it, already knew. That was one. Shell developed most of the deep water drilling equipment for the entire Gulf. We sold it at one period in time when Shell felt that it was going to be too many years before they could get into the deep water. We held a school and we charged $250,000 per student to come in, and we showed them the Shell Lockheed system that was later used for Petrobras to develop their deep water fields. Again, way in advance of anyone else. And those things made real money for Shell. When we had the bright spot approach, think of it. We had the bright spots probably a full 5 years before anyone else. And to give you one example, I took that into Cameroon, and in Cameroon, in 1 year, we had 20 straight discoveries, the first 20 discoveries in offshore Cameroon, all with bright spots without a failure in 1 year. We made a lot of use of Shell's research.
Is there anyone out there now who's doing it?
I don't know. I don't travel and I don't see, but I did go to Schlumberger's facilities about 4 or 5 years ago. They're doing some very significant work in their research laboratories. I wouldn't put it past Halliburton also. I'm not aware of anything being done in the major industrial labs around the world. From what I've seen of them, I've only visited E&I. I visited a few other, ConocoPhillips. They're adequate, supportive, but they're not a decade ahead of the rest of the world. And I think that's where you have to be in an industrial laboratory, a decade ahead.
Marlan, you spent so much of your time with international exploration. How has it changed over the last couple of decades? Do you see any patterns? Or?
Oh yeah. Do you remember that at one time the big oil companies, the Seven Sisters, bestrode the world like Goliaths? We had the technology. We alone could find the oil. We alone could produce the oil. We alone could market the oil. We alone had the capital to develop the oil. That's turned inside out. Now, the national oil companies could care less about our capital. They've got more capital than sense. The only reason they would want us to invest is the bottom tier of their projects. The one in Sakhalin or in ice-frozen northern Russia. Those are the only things they want our money and our efforts. The technology is available now through the major contractors. I'm not sure that I know of any substantive technology that isn't available through the contractors if you're willing to pay for it. So we've had a complete reversal. Now the national oil companies control the oil and gas business outside, and they're moving themselves to other countries using their teams to control the resource allocations. Exxon, Shell, Chevron, those companies, I don't think anyone thinks they'll ever grow substantially. They can be extremely profitable, but that's what we call a liquidation phase in financial cycles. They control large amounts of assets, and no one better than they can monetize those. But does anybody think that Shell could double in its asset base without buying other smaller companies? Not a chance. You can't grow. There isn't that. The national oil companies control the huge resource bases.
So where is the room for growth? Excuse me?
Well, for growth in, I would say it's in the national oil companies. They have, after all, they've got about 93% of the oil is their oil. They don't need us anymore. They may want us, especially to do the more difficult, expensive, the deep water, the ice-frozen areas, the places in the back of beyond, like Sakhalin Island. But you don't think they're going to let us in to do the easy stuff, to find 5 billion barrel oil fields in Iran and Iraq.
So that probably means that if you cannot grow anymore, you can develop like an organism, right? You grow up, then you stop growing up, and you develop. And so maybe the private oil companies now, they have just to be vanguard.
Yeah, I'm not just sure where to go. I would hate to be trying to choose a philosophy for Shell or Exxon in the future, but it would not, if I were, it would not be one that's predicated on doubling my reserve asset base in 10 or 15 years. It would be instead probably to move upstream into those kind of products that are ancillary, that are peripheral, but are part of energy, that have much higher value per unit hydrocarbon molecule. I'd be going more and more into chemicals, to pesticides. I'd be going into plastics. I'd be going into anything that gives me not $100 for a barrel of oil, but $500 for a barrel of polystyrene, for example. I think that's where their strengths will be, is moving to the higher valued things, which they alone can do. But then I'm often wrong.
Marlan, I have to ask about unconventional resources. I couldn't help but noticing, and I'm sure you did too, at the AAPG convention, they were going to have a debate on who's for it and who's against it, and they couldn't find very many to be against it anymore. So what's become unconventional seems to be...
Yeah, that's right. And when it shows, we talk about research failings of the large oil companies. The little or the small oil companies have never had research, but what they have is tiger blood. They're out there scratching every day, trying to make a buck, watching very hard about where things are going, what can be done, what are the frontiers of knowledge, where can they make a little money, while the majors sit placidly waiting for someone to tell them how to extract oil from oil shale. The little companies are growing. They're not using research, they're using iteration. They're trying it 10 times, 20 different ways, and they're being very successful at scrabbling, at moving, at doing things. And what's the role of the majors? Well, merely to bring capital. Isn't that a sad thing? The role of the majors is to bring capital to fund things being done by small oil companies.
Any comments about unconventional resources?
Well, you said it very well. What is unconventional now? Gas hydrates? Algae, maybe. But the things of getting oil and gas out of source rocks is now conventional. If we want to talk about unconventional, we better move over to other things that haven't been proven and are still too difficult for us.
What are those of the future? 15 years ago, nobody thought much of shale, and now it's widely accepted. What are the things 15 years from now, people will look back and say, that was obvious, it was plain as could be.
Well, there I think that's the difference between a government approach and a seething ferment of independent minds. A government approach would be to say, well, find me somebody smart and ask them what we're going to be doing 15 years from now. That's a road to failure. Instead, put all of these seething minds that you've got here in Houston directed towards making money in energy, and watch what they come up with. That's what's going to work. I don't know which way it'll go, but that's how we do it.
So going beyond gas and oil now, I read that you have turned your thoughts to sustainable energy for municipalities. Can you talk about that?
Sustainable? Well, mainly what I do in the field of sustainable is sort out the BS. Whenever I hear somebody talk about sustainable, I make sure they understand my definition. And that is, I don't want sustainable losses. If it ain't making money, to use the vernacular, it ain't sustainable. So I have a nice simple way of looking at it. I like to have things that are repeatable, maybe regrowable, but if they don't make money, if they cost money, I will say, by my definition, they cannot be sustainable. No one wants sustainable losses in their investment portfolio. No one truly wants any sustainable oil production or energy production that costs you more than it's worth every year that you have it. And I have a very peculiar idea on sustainable. Don't even talk to me about it unless you can show me that it makes money and therefore is survivable in the future. Any fool can create something that's being grown and loses money every year. That's what farmers in Nebraska used to do, is lose money every year. But that's not a good idea. So I have a particular focus on sustainable. The other thing that I do kind of look at that you might have heard me mention once, I am also interested in seeing how we can help communities do a better job, because if you look at the needs of a given community and what the resources are that are available to communities, you see all sorts of things that aren't readily known are available to communities if they attack them properly. They don't solve the problems of the world, they don't solve the problems of the U.S., they don't solve the problems of Texas, but all San Antonio had to do was to spend $6 million to put in a methane digester on its sewage outfall, and they're generating enough electricity, it pays out in 2 years, and it's generating enough electricity to save them about $6 million going forward every 2 years on their electric bill. Now, you can see you can't take San Antonio's sewage plant and extrapolate that worldwide, but you can look at what the problems are in communities and see how better to make use of energy. And that's a thing that I think geologists and physicists can do a lot better job of showing people what in their community is available. In some areas, it might be low temperature geothermal, maybe just what they need for some uses. Let's just say you've got a large scale heating problems for a penitentiary or low cost housing. Geothermal waters, even though it's only running at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, can do great for that kind of work if you plan for it. If you're building a subdivision in Arizona, you ought to be thinking about how you're going to modify the houses so that those can be cooled properly with electricity generated by solar. And when you do it, try to remember that you start with 3 times as much sun in Arizona than you do in New York. So you can't take that same parlor trick and play it in New York. It only works in Arizona. But I think we can do a lot better of looking around these local areas and showing them how to do a better job. Think of it this way. Have you ever ran across anyone in all our profession whose job it is to show a community how to minimize its energy costs and maximize the benefits for a community? Every little community's got a civil engineer, a county engineer, a city engineer who does this important stuff for them. I think it's a new profession and going to be available out there.
By the way, do you think is there any controversy working for an oil company and being an environmentalist?
No, not that I can think of. I would say that intrinsically you couldn't find a more environmentally conscious group than geologists and probably engineers in petroleum companies. I would say probably not, because by choice they are people who have gravitated not to the cities, not to being medical doctors, but people who love the land. You can't find a geologist who doesn't love the land. And when you do that, you're already halfway there to appreciate environmental protection. I would only say we don't want stupid environmental protection. We want it to be done well and thoroughly. We like it.
I have to ask about your famous quote, "Geology is a science and exploration is a business." Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, one of the problems I've found over the years is that we geologists so love to find oil, to look for oil, to test hypotheses in the unknown part of the world, that we sometimes forget that they're paying us to make money finding oil. They're not paying us to enjoy learning about the earth. And I always wanted to remind my wonderful staff that at the end, if you're not successful in the business of finding oil, you're going to have to pay for your geology hobby yourself.
You've written a paper on lessons from history, and I know postmortems and studying failure is something that you're fascinated with. Can you share with us some of the reasons why you feel that's so important?
Oh, sure. And it isn't an original idea outside of the oil business. I read about it in a book by Samuel Eliot Morison, the naval historian, when he introduced me to this wonderful idea of how the Naval War College trained their officers by providing them with all the information that was coming into the bridge, say at a famous naval battle, and then ask them to make the proper decisions under the gun with just the information available on the bridge at that time. And so what I tried to do was create that same sort of a setup in Shell and in ARCO by having people take a look first at just the information that is available at the time you make decisions, and then have them try to train themselves by telling me how they would have solved this problem. That way, I can tell them how it came out and whether their procedure, their post-mortem, worked properly, and I'm going to ask them to learn from my failures. And as a broadened way, in ARCO, we made it a rule, every significant wildcat is followed up by a post-mortem in which another team takes the data, takes a look at it, and without any kind of pejorative remarks on who it was to made the original decisions, another group takes a look at the drilling recommendation and says, was there something else we should have seen wrong or different or better in this? And we did it for every single wildcat. And by that, I hoped to get people to have as much experience drilling dry holes as I have, but without drilling all the dry holes that I have.
Any comments for people entering the business today and young, for young geologists and the next generation of geologists? Any comments or thoughts?
Which challenges there are?
The next profession, the next generation of explorers.
Well, see, that's Julie. Julie's my next generation, and I'll just say the kids coming along are so bright, so able, that all they need to do is be challenged, and then you kind of step out of the way. Remember that wonderful Marine Corps phrase, lead, follow, or get the hell out of the way? That's what I see about the young staff coming on. You know, it's, hey, I might whisper some supposed words of wisdom, but it's, they know their business.
So, any special advice for Julie?
No, I'm very fortunate. Think of it this way. I was talking with Bob Gunn, with Bill Barrett, several other people who are fortunate enough to have children following them, and all agree what a wonderful thing it is to have one of your children following you and exceeding what you did. Isn't that astounding? Very flattering and delightful.
What do you think about that, Julie?
I think I'm going to keep bringing my son and daughter up here every chance I get and show them how much I truly love doing this. It's a passion. I mean, you just look at all of us. Lori's still doing it after retirement. Why are we doing it? Because it's a passion, especially when you grow up with it all around your life, as my kids do.
Don't you think that you had to do what you are doing?
I tried not to, actually. I started out in physics and mathematics. I was taking geology as a hobby for fun because I knew geology. I was outdoors all the time with the family as we were growing up. And yes, we did have Dad around. We did do lots of fun things. And so no, I didn't. In fact, I really tried to just make my own way and was taking geology for fun, and then they told me about geophysics. And so I took all the geology I had, I combined it with the physics, and I went into this world as a geophysicist. And it just turned out that life has a funny way of working out how it should, and here I am with Dad, and
You know, if I can say one other thing, to go down one more generation, we name our prospects after the grandchildren. So we've got a well drilling on Gracie right now in western Montana. We just sold Jan, which is an anagram, and the kids really follow the prospects because they're named after them.
Okay, guys, well, thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.